Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And today we're updating the meeting DRAC page. Now, I have been a little bit remiss at updating it, but as you can see, as a simple text box, it's very easy to go into the edit mode and just start typing and altering things pretty much as you would do in a Word document. But of course, once you save it, everyone else reads it as a standard web page. Now, by the time you're watching this, I'll be halfway through my September US mini trip, so there's not really much point putting the schedule up now. But since I've already written the schedule for the Italy trip in Excel, I can copy it as plain text and alter it quite easily to my personal specifications. So as you can see, starting on the 14th of October on the Monday, I'll be at the Venice Naval Museum. Then on the Wednesday, I'll be at the Vittoriale degli Italiani near Lake Garda. On the Thursday, I'm in Genoa. Friday, La Spezia, Saturday, Pisa, and Sunday, the Nemi Ship Museum just south of Rome. And then I'll be flying back home. So once again, yeah, if you happen to be Italian and near any of those regions, you want to come and say hi, I'll be there during the museum opening hours. And then, of course, in Squarespace, once I've made my necessary edits, I just hit save, exit, and it's all done. Nice and easy. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Now, something I've occasionally seen questioned with regards to the video I did a few years ago on Operation Rheinübung, the Chronicle of Bismarck's final voyage, is exactly how fast HMS Rodney managed to get up to in her efforts to catch and eventually kill the German battleship. Now, in that video, I mentioned that at one point her speed approached 25 knots, so eager was she to get into combat. This seems to attract some ire, both in a few comments and elsewhere online, but unfortunately, a lot, although I must say not all, of these objections seem to rest on a, shall we say, very selective reading of the evidence at hand. And occasionally that's accompanied by a failure to appreciate the full context of what Rodney was actually trying to do in the days leading up to that climactic battle. So, let's lay some groundwork first. As built, the Nelson class was essentially an amalgamation of a lot of the work that had been done for the G3 battle cruisers and the N3 battleships in the run-up to the Washington Treaty. With the treaty limitations in mind, these concepts had been downscaled, and the result was what would eventually become Design 03, which would then be refined very slightly into the final form that was the Nelson class. Now, a lot of work had gone into the underwater form of the G3 and N3 designs, particularly the G3, much more than was usual for the average capital ship. This was in part due to limitations on the size of British naval infrastructure. Exceptionally large slipways and dry docks did exist, but as with any navy, having a very limited number of spaces to service your ships essentially means that you effectively have none if you want to build a class or two classes of large vessel. For the 1920s British Empire, this was even more an acute issue. There were actually large enough yards and large enough dry docks in the UK to accommodate some of the larger ideas, like the K3 or I3 battle cruisers, even if only just, but such vessels also would need to be serviced abroad, at Gibraltar, Malta, or Singapore, for instance. And so hull size had needed to be reduced, particularly on the battlecruiser ideas, so that they could fit in these dry docks found overseas. A shorter hull, of course, meant a less favourable length-to-beam ratio, assuming that you kept the beam roughly the same, and this would, of course, therefore lead to a drop in speed. This was obviously bad for both designs, but particularly for the battlecruisers, and hence intensive work was done into refining the hydrodynamics of the ship in order to absolutely maximise speed on both a reduced power output, because with a shorter ship you had less room for your power plant, and a slightly less than ideal length to beam ratio. Much of this work was then incorporated into the Nelson class, and this was reflected in their performance after they had been launched. For comparison with the other two roughly contemporary Washington Naval Treaty era 16-inch ship classes, the Colorado class were designed to do 21 knots using 28,900 shaft horsepower. On trials, one of the class did manage 21.09 knots, but that's a speed increase so small that if you ran a ship at 21 knots and this ship going at 21.09 over the course of an hour, the faster ship would finish just a little under a single Colorado ship's length further ahead than the one travelling at precisely 21. In order to do this, however, the ship generated a fraction under 31,300 shaft horsepower. This represented a little over 8% more power generation than was designed, but only netted them a 0.4% increase over design speed. The Nagato class was designed to do 26.5 knots using 80,000 shaft horsepower. On trials, Nagato managed 26.7 knots with 85,500 shaft horsepower, and Mutsu required 87,500 shaft horsepower to do the same. This corresponds to a roughly 7 and 9% increase in shaft horsepower over design, respectively, in exchange for a 0.7% speed increase. The Nelsons, on the other hand, were designed for 23 knots on 45,000 shaft horsepower. On trials, Rodney managed 23.8 knots, which is the largest margin over design speed of any of the three classes in absolute terms, and 0.2 of a knot faster than even her sister ship, Nelson, and she managed this on 45,614 shaft horsepower, which is just under a 1.4% addition to power over design in exchange for almost 3.5% more speed. As well as demonstrating the highly efficient design of her hull, it also means that, when compared to a known and measured speed, she only needs to find just over a knot to match the speed that I described in the Bismarck video. And she had several thousand more shaft horsepower in potential overload capacity in her engines to do this with. But, I can hear you ask, that trial was in 1927. By 1941, she was a much older ship, considerably more worn, she'd had additional weight stuck on her, and in particular, you even told us that her machinery was pretty much shot and needed repairs and replacement, which is why she was at sea in the first place. She was heading over to the US to have a complete machinery overhaul, amongst other things. And yes, you'd be perfectly right in those statements. However, there is something else to bear in mind before we look at Rodney's pursuit of Bismarck itself. When it comes to boilers, there are a few different ways for them to degrade and eventually break down, some of which are more catastrophic than others. But one thing to bear in mind overall is that the maximum rated power of a set of boilers doesn't mean if you exceed this by as much as a single shaft horsepower, it will explode. As we just saw, all three Washington Naval Treaty era 16-inch battleship classes did exceed their design power by varying margins, and none of them had their boilers violently disassemble as a result. What this reflects, as I covered in my video on ship spoilers, is that instead what you're looking at is a maximum safe sustained power output. You can force more power out of a ship's machinery, but you'll end up with a combination of potentially burning an inefficient amount of fuel compared to the increase in power output that you get, also putting a lot more wear and tear on the components, shortening their lifespan, possibly dramatically, and of course you run an increased risk of something failing in the short term. An ancillary for the wear and tear issue is not just the rapid drop in component lifespan, but also the fact you may cause widespread small-scale damage that will then limit what you can do the next time you run your machinery up to speed. You could see this, for example, in an everyday car. you can run the car in the advised safe zone of RPM, or you could run around with it redlining all the time. Now, redlining the car will make you go a bit faster for a given gear, but you'll be burning a massive amount more fuel. And although you might be able to run a car 100,000 miles or more easily by sticking to the safe zone, if you constantly redline the car, it's likely to break something in the engine considerably sooner than that. And between when you start driving while torturing the engine and when it finally decides it's had enough, you may notice that subsequent drives are a little bit slower, and then a little bit slower, and a little bit slower, and so on. So just because Rodney's machinery was on its way out doesn't necessarily prevent Rodney from effectively redlining her machinery for a while. In fact, the very fact that it was dying would potentially add a little bit of incentive, because as long as you don't run it so high that you break things immediately, it doesn't really matter if you wreck the machinery in such a manner that it'll break down in the next 10,000 miles instead of in the next 30,000, because you're going to replace it long before either of those figures anyway. And we'll see, subsequently, that some damage was indeed caused. So, in any case, on to the pursuit. At the time that Rodney was instructed to hunt down Bismarck, she was a few hundred miles east to east-southeast of Bismarck, depending on how you run the exact timings, whether you go from when Rodney was told that Hood was destroyed, when the Admiralty initially told her to pursue, when Rodney broke off from the liner she was escorting, or whatever, but all in the course of a day. The general point is she had to intercept Bismarck, but she was, of course, slower, whichever speed she was going to go at. Now, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton was pretty sure that whatever the Admiralty was telling him, that Bismarck was in fact heading for France. Remember, they sent King George V off on a bit of a wild goose chase due to screwed up coordinates. And so he decided that he had to reach Bismarck's projected course, the one that he thought Bismarck was going on, ahead of Bismarck, which would mean that Bismarck would then overhaul them at some point and battle could be engaged, or he at least had to reach that area close enough behind Bismarck that she could be slowed down by either destroyer torpedo attack or aircraft torpedo bomber attack. But either way, it meant Rodney had to get from where she was to where Dalrymple Hamilton thought Bismarck was going to be as fast as humanly possible, because if she husbanded her engines, she'd be late, and she wouldn't be able to catch up because the gap would be too large. Now, bear in mind, of course, at this point when he's making these decisions, that the damage that was incurred by Bismarck that slowed her down, initially that hit in the bow from Prince of Wales's shell, and then later on the attacks from the Swordfish, was, at the point he's making this initial choice, not something that was known to Dalrymple Hamilton. So it was in light of these considerations that Rodney's crew began to push the ship to the absolute limits. She needed to get to the operational combat zone, and as we said, coddling the engines and getting there late was considerably worse than useless. And the testimony of several of Rodney's crew members refer directly to the efforts that they made at this stage. One of them recounted, "We worked the engines up to faster than they had ever been, I think since trials, which meant pouring water on top of parts that were getting hot, just pumping seawater straight on top to cool them down." Now, spoiler alert, pumping freezing cold seawater right onto your machinery casings to cool them down is not normal procedure, even when you are on trials, and it indicates that an immense amount of energy was being shunted through them compared to anything the ship was designed to sustain, because, if you were pumping 45,000 shaft horsepower or equivalent amount of energy through the ship's machinery, they're not going to be transmitting so much heat through the casings that you need to urgently cool it down or risk catastrophic failure. It's also recorded that people in the engine room began to pass out due to the heat. Again, this is not typical even in trials for oil-fired turbine-driven ships. In fact, compared to vertical ship expansion engine ships and coal-fired ships, the relatively speaking cool nature of the machinery spaces was a big plus. And so this is once more indicative of a machinery plant that is being pushed well beyond its limits, with some of that excess energy radiating out into the machinery space. And it was during this stage of proceedings that the crew themselves attest that Rodney had beaten her design speed by 2 knots, which of course meant she was going at around 25 knots. Given the efforts involved and the conditions they described, they were certainly pushing the engines quite a bit past regular tolerances, which then makes this account entirely believable, considering that, as we mentioned earlier, at essentially her design power, she was already a bit faster than her design speed. Now, it's important to note that Rodney's power plant wasn't without issues generally. Another crew member mentioned that our boilers were originally saturated steam boilers adapted for superheaters. They had generating tubes blanked off and superheaters inserted, which were always a source of trouble. Compromise is never the best thing, so we always had a degree of boiler trouble and leaking superheater tubes. Now, it's further noted by the crew that at round about the time Rodney and King George V met up and then subsequently engaged Bismarck, quite a number of tubes in the boilers were having to be actively plugged and fixed while the ship was still underway in order to keep the ship from losing power, because obviously if you have a small leak and you leave it alone, the kind of pressures you're dealing with in a battleship's boiler plant, those small leaks will very quickly become large leaks and then really bad things start to happen. In particular, a chap called Scouse Nesbitt, presumably due to his origins in Liverpool, was noted to be of small stature. He was the smallest in the machinery spaces, actually, and he was sent into the boilers to make these repairs. And this wasn't dockside repairs. The fuel wasn't being fed in and ignited, but that was pretty much it. It was still insanely hot in the boiler. And so after a very short break to allow a modicum of cooling, poor old Scouse was wrapped in wet sacking and then had fire hoses sprayed around and on him to stop him being cooked alive inside the boiler while he made those repairs. With those repairs complete, the boiler could then be fired up again fairly quickly, and he was presumably sat to one side and given a drink of water until something else broke. It's also during this latter stage, once Bismarck had essentially been locked down and the British battleships were on final approach, that you get the 2 most commonly quoted statements from the ship in regards to her speed by people who disagree that Rodney couldn't possibly have got up to 25 knots. Namely, one crewman who opines that they weren't going much faster than 19 knots, although it should be noted he wasn't part of the engineering crew or the bridge crew, and, of course, the famous signal to King George V, "I'm afraid that your 22 knots is a bit faster than ours." However, as we've seen from the foregoing, these statements refer to a time somewhat after the high-speed run that Rodney did to get in position in the first place, and taken in context of both the crew statements about what she could do at various times and the later, rather drastic need for running repairs, plus, of course, what state her machinery was in at the start of all this, it actually becomes fairly easy to piece together what happened. When Hood was destroyed, and the Admiralty ordered Rodney to hunt Bismarck down, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton pulled out all the stops, and the machinery spaces were promptly turned into radiating heat furnaces as the ship and its power plant was pushed well past their tolerances. On this stage of the run, she does indeed exceed her design speed, and likely hits 25 knots as recorded by the crew. However, this comes at a cost to her already worn machinery, and subsequently, once she's slowed down, it's found to be practically leaking like a sieve with near constant small failures, directly due to the recent heavily overtaxing run. Faced with the loss of power as the result of these numerous small leaks, and at any given time potentially being in the process of either shutting down, fixing, or working the heat and therefore pressure back up in at least one of her boilers, Rodney would have been somewhat down on available power at the time she meets up with King George V. Now, it doesn't matter quite as much at this stage, because Bismarck is now known to have been slowed down to a point she's even slower than Rodney, and out of control, which Rodney fortunately wasn't. But the damage that Rodney is now fixing on the fly to just keep the machinery plant operational for the next few hours is pretty much a direct result of the massive effort she made to get there on time in the first place. So, did Rodney hit 25 knots chasing Bismarck? Was she unable to hit 23 during her fight with the German ship? Well, the answer to both is yes. And one of them, almost certainly, directly led to the other.